Hi folks, John Dunn here, RPG freelancer, publisher behind Meliorvia. I'm up here today at Immortals Inc. with Mikey.
What is up, John? We are here. We are present.
And we got Carlos over here on the other mic.
Woo!
Yeah, that was a good one.
I'm sorry.
I felt that in my ears. I felt that.
Might want to adjust the level on that one,
I'm
Mikey.
keeping it turned up. That's how we are.
I think my BLT sandwich just kicked in.
BLTs do that.
A lot of protein.
Oh, God. So we're going to talk about something a little spooky today, and Carlos is going to sit in on it because I think we were heckling him too much last podcast.
Yeah, and I think you guys are the spooky
A lot of
guys.
negative stuff coming out of you guys.
So we're going to talk today about Old Gods of Appalachia. This is based on a podcast that I have listened to one whole episode of, but Carlos said, you got to check this out because old gods and eldritch things and Appalachian horror.
If I may clarify, I've heard of it. I haven't listened to any of it. I plan on listening to it, but then all of a sudden I went to Gen Con and this book was like blowing up. Everybody was like talking about it there. I'm like, oh, I should listen to that. Hey, John, you should.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Because that looked pretty thick, and I don't know if I'd be reading that at any time soon.
So the lead designer on this is Shauna Germain. She's done a lot of other work for Monty Cook as well as quite a few other companies, including No Thank You Evil, and a lot of work on the Cypher system, which is Monty Cook's house system, not something that's compatible with 5th edition D&D. We'll come back. You may have seen that depending on the order these episodes air in. This is based on the podcast Old Gods of Appalachia from Cam Collins and Steve Shell, who also did some of the principal writing on this. And like I said, it does use the Cypher system. This was funded with a 2022 April Kickstarter. It raised $2 million and had about 15,000 backers. So I'm going to say this podcast gets a couple more views than we do.
$2 million.
$2 million in funding, yes.
Well, no wonder it was all over the place down at Gen Con.
So, Old Gods of Appalachia. Now, I'm from the Midwest. We say Appalachia.
I was gonna say
But
Appalachia.
apparently, as I was looking through the book and listening to the podcast, it's very clear it's supposed to be Appalachia.
The American Midwest accent is the proper one. So we're going to go with Appalachia.
It's actually one of the
Very
things
proud,
that they mention
very proud.
early in the book, saying if you don't say Appalachia, you're clearly not from that area.
Yeah, I'm very proud of this, my English.
So it is set in the early 1900s, and it has eldritch horror elements, which make me immediately think of Cthulhu and Lovecraft. And the fact that it is Appalachia and fantasy and horror made me immediately think of The Chained Coffin that we talked about for DCC, and the works of Manly Wade Williams, who is one of the Appendix N authors.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, look at you tying
These are the
in
places my mind went to, not, wow, it blew up at Gen Con. I should make John record this.
Listen.
Two different perspectives.
Listen. So,
I thought there was actually a thought process on Carlos'
can't
side here.
remember anything being free in here.
The book opens up with chapter 1, gives a brief overview of both the podcast and the setting, and then dives into chapter 2, which gives a brief overview of the Cypher system. After that, chapters 3 through 7 are kind of hooked together as part 2 of the book, and this is called Welcome to the Family. It's about the first 112 pages of the book. This gives character creation and then gets into your Cypher creation elements, your types, your descriptors, and your foci. The types, you get Protector, which is kind of a warrior class, a Sage, which is kind of a magic user, kind of a healer. Think a Hungan maybe, or a witch, that type of folk magic person. Then you get to an Explorer, which is kind of a rangery type, where you're looking around, finding out what's out there in the wilderness. And then you get into the Speaker, which is the last of the 4 types. And the Speaker is kind of your face character, or maybe almost a bard, because they can have a little bit of magic. After we get into types, we get into our descriptors. There's 40 of them. They're all really well themed. About half of these are new. I did a side-by-side comparison with the Cypher System core book and this one, and about half of them were not in there. There were some similarities, but definitely new content. And so if you do have the regular Cypher System rulebook and this one side by side, that's going to open up some more options for you. After that, we get into our foci. There's 25 of them. They're almost all new. Some of them are kind of adapted from existing ones, but not many. This is stuff that's, again, really well themed to our isolated horror Appalachia, old gods type setting that we're talking about here. Last bit of the Welcome to the Family section is goods and services. And this is, again, well themed for the early 20th century, gear that's really appropriate for that. There's also some material that talks about the coal industry and the logging industry, which were a big part of that region in this time period. The next chunk after that, part 3, is chapters 8 and 9. It's called Playing the Game. This is basically just the game rules for Cypher, and then a section on the XP system. The XP system is a little more themed than what's in the Cypher system core rulebook, but if you've already got the Cypher system, a lot of this is going to seem really familiar. Worth mentioning.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
On a serious note, Cypher system is its own core rules.
Yeah, it's totally its own core rules.
Do you need the Cypher system?
You do not need the core rule book for this. This is a standalone
book.
book. Yeah, absolutely. You do actually have a couple other supplements for the Cypher system. I think we may have talked about one or two of those before.
That's where I was getting to. But yeah, I was like, I'm trying to think because that's pretty thick, and it seemed like I
mean,
just flipped through, and it seemed like the rules were there.
This is a 414-page book. It's got all the rules you need in here.
Yeah, self-contained. I was hoping.
Chapters 10 to 16 are, I think, part 4 at this point, and it's called The Darkest Mountains in the World. This is the heart and soul of your setting information. It opens up with an overview, and then you get chapters devoted to Pennsylvania, Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. Gonna touch on some spoilers. There's definitely spoilers for the podcast in here as well. One thing that I think is really well done here is that each of these different locations have multiple sandboxes. So you get into the states, and then there's multiple cities described in each of those states where there's NPCs and different hooks to draw your characters in.
I'm hoping that this ties in. I'll be pleasantly surprised when I will listen to the podcast, if it ties in well with the book.
Yeah, I think it ties in very well, at least thematically from what I listened to. And like I mentioned, the people behind the podcast wrote chunks of this book.
Yeah,
so
because
very much on board.
I would like to see that. That's helpful. Like stuff we talk about. Like I'm more like I like the idea that you could get the atmosphere of where you're going to go play, and it helps you build it up so you're ready to play. That you understand where you're going into. Like almost like when you go into D&D, I'm going to go fight a dragon. Like this. The Gods of, that's like a title's like tells you something, but if you were able to listen to it, you could get immersed in the world, and then.
Yeah, and the intro did actually talk about that, whether or not you've listened to the podcast. If you have listened to the podcast, XYZ. If you haven't, start with this section. And here's how to introduce your players to the setting if they haven't listened to the podcast.
Yeah, because I feel like the reason, I've heard of the podcast, and then I saw the book, and then I started hearing about it. Like I said, I'm like, oh, now I want to go listen. Now I want to read.
I get you. Like I said, I gave a listen to an episode and got another one queued up. So it's fun, but that's not but we're here to talk about this book, right? The next bit is you got your history, your timeline, which does tie into the podcast. So it tells you what episodes happen in what years going through here. A discussion on granny magic, which is kind of the folk magic that's present in the area.
Rub some butter on it.
Sometimes. The green, which is kind of the mountains themselves, the presence of magic and life throughout the mountains. The things, which are kind of otherworldly entities. Others. And then a section on transportation and communication, because you got to remember, this is primarily set in the early 1900s. There weren't phone lines everywhere, and when phone lines did show up, it was a big deal. You're relying oftentimes on the railroad to get information as it's carrying the post. But even with that, not always incredibly reliable. Things get lost.
The amount of seclusion.
It's a big deal.
Even to this day.
Yes. Yeah. When people are in a holler, they may not know what's happening even just a few miles outside it. It goes through different regions, starting off with Pennsylvania, and it talks about the Barrow and Lock Railroad and Mining Company. I know that mostly from Monopoly as the B&L Railroad. I don't know.
Easter egg.
There you go. I mean, it's a historic thing, but that's how I know it.
Those doggone historians and their Easter eggs.
And it talks about one of the mines in Pennsylvania because coal country. And then there's a town called Avalon that gets a bit of a write-up here as kind of a sandbox area. And Avalon's kind of cool because it's what happens to a town when everyone in it is undead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I feel importing food wasn't being too important to the point.
Well, I think maybe the people that are driving by become the food.
Tourism might go down.
Kentucky is the next chapter. Barlow is a mining town where there was a fire damp explosion. So the mountains don't really like people coming in and mining them is one of the themes here. And so people pay the price when they do that. And when that explosion happened, things broke free from beneath. There's some other sections in there. One that jumped out at me was a haunted circus, because who doesn't need a haunted circus, right? Yeah, exactly.
Clowns.
Next chapter is North Carolina. And they talk about the city of Boone, which isn't exactly a sprawling metropolis. It's still a pretty small town, but they call it the heart of Appalachia because a lot of different trains connect there. So you've got steel passing through, coal passing through, logging passing through, and stuff happening there because of all that interaction. Also, there's some really fun murders that have happened in Boone.
Well, I mean,
Fun, yeah.
Yeah. After North Carolina, we get into Tennessee, the Blue Ridge Mountains, a particular town in there called Baker's Gap, which is kind of isolated in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And most importantly, when you talk about Tennessee, you got the Moonshiner.
well, you have to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those are that's an underrated group of guys.
Well, the Moonshiner
people.
here, I'm assuming it shows up in the podcast, is an entity. It's not just...
I imagine. You could see.
Virginia covers Esau County and a town called Paradise. West Virginia starts off with a ghost town called Tourniquet. And one of the things that jumped out at me as I was looking through this chapter was a church that had snake worship.
Well, that's kind of normal.
Sure. But then some of the snakes were, let's just say, not normal. Yeah. And then there's a bit talking about rough and rowdy fighting, because a lot of these places are kind of isolated and there might not be government oversight. People settle matters by, duking it out, often in the town square.
I mean, we do that here. The dumpster.
Yeah.
And when they're doing it, though, they go for disfiguring injuries. So one of the
No.
surest way to settle these matters is by gouging somebody's eye out.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
save
Send
on
them
Thing
glasses.
to keep in mind.
Send them to
Glasses
Undead
last twice
City.
as long.
The next chunk of the book, chapters 17 to 20, is the running the game section. Again, this is about 120-ish pages. This is primarily directed towards the game master, the narrator. Talks about using the rules, gives you about a little, actually more than 90 ciphers here, which are really well themed to the setting. Then about 40 artifacts in the next chapter, again, extremely well themed. And then your kind of monster manual chunk of the book called Haints, Spirits, and Other Revenants. There's more than 30 of these here. The ones that jumped out at me were the Kudzu Man.
Wait, I know that one. You've heard that.
No.
Probably in MetaZoo.
Probably, yeah.
It's probably.
And then this just horrific picture called a not deer, which is sort of looks like a deer, but it's got like 8 eyes and
But it's not.
spikes coming off, and it's not a deer. Again, I'm betting that's shown up in the podcast somewhere.
I think you've seen some over here down the street.
I don't
Remember?
doubt it.
Oh, we had deer strapped in here. Remember? Outside the window.
Last
deer.
big chunk of the book are chapters 21 and 22. These are a couple of adventures. Again, very well themed to the setting. The first one is called The Luthier's Folly. Talks about a cursed fiddle. I mean, what could be more appropriate?
That's pretty appropriate.
And then the last one is What Paths May Cross, which is about a train derailment. There are a lot of moving parts going on with that train derailment. Just the adventure summary, I was reading through it going, oh, there is a lot happening here. After that, we get into a bibliography, which talks about a lot of the source material, both fiction and nonfiction, that were used in the development of the podcast. What really surprised me, based on my initial impression, is that neither Lovecraft nor Manly Wade Williams are mentioned in the bibliography.
There's a lot, and America that's scary.
Yeah, there
like
is. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah,
but when I was going into it thinking, oh, these are going to be the big influences. Well,
honestly,
no.
I thought that too. I'm like, it was very good. But then once I started looking, I'm like, that's not classic
really not.
Lovecraft.
Yeah.
It's kind of like something else from it. But
and then we get some tools for helping with consent, a solid index of the book, and the character sheet. It's 414 pages. It is a lavishly illustrated hardcover book with just some gorgeous pieces throughout. Naturally, not all of them are jumping out at me as I'm flipping through here, but
of course not.
Yeah. Hardcover from Monty Cook Games in conjunction with Deep Nerd Media, the group behind the podcast.
Deep Nerd Media.
Yep.
Okay, go ahead.
And this is $70. We've got copies up here at Immortals Inc. on the shelf. If this sounds like something that would be fun to you, I encourage you, stop in, take a look through, or hit us up at immortalsinc.com.
And if you think woods aren't scary,
they're terrifying.
They are. I have
all you got to do is go camping a couple of times.
Well, yes, I went to North Carolina, the Appalachia Mountains, and Appalachia. And I was funny because my buddy took me and he's like, come on, we'll go for a camp. And I'm like, all right, I'll go. I figured I was going canoeing and have a nice time. Next thing I know, I'm above the clouds. It's a whole terrible story of how I got in a pickup truck and 3 hours later I'm above the clouds. And to actually, when you start walking, there's nothing.
No.
It's just woods. You don't hear nothing and there's not.
Don't bother bringing your cell phone because there's nothing for it to connect to.
We had a satellite phone that I don't think worked. And then, we were just there and it was just, but it's bizarre because you're walking there and you just see like, you could walk for 4 or 5 hours or 2 days and there's nothing. And all of a sudden you just come across the full-blown cemetery with the newest headstone from like 1840 or something. And you're like, why is this in the middle of nowhere?
And the way the hollers are set up, there might be somebody half a mile away from you and you've got no idea.
No, not at all. Or that you'd run into like old train tracks, just a couple of tracks that go nowhere. And then, or a house. It's just...
Right. And I mean, that
you got away from very quickly because you're going to die.
In the theming in here that there are, ghost towns and abandoned towns that, the mine dried up.
Oh, no. Yeah. And then if you get stuck,
Oh, you're done.
I think the scariest part of that is we were walking and just a whole tent set up with nothing. It like had been abandoned, just a tent, some clothes, food and everything. And it was like a whole setup and it just like abandoned. And we're like, this guy's dead somewhere.
He was sitting in the bushes nearby with a sniper rifle.
Oh, yeah, we did a couple of acts and like we're out because we were ready to camp. And I'm like, no.
He's taking a leak.
Out of a bear.
What bears do when they don't think you're there.
I know. Oh my God, terrible. But yeah, it's a lot of good stuff. It's a good setting, and if you ever a chance to go up there, just see and you'll see how isolated and different and. The fact of a cell phone has made us soft, if you ask me. But anyway, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Just thought I'd share that.
All right, that's pretty much everything I got. Till next time, folks. Good gaming.
Later.